Just turn it off no matter what. I don't know if this will destroy most of the relationships in my life, but these are people that crash because of other dopamine-seeking behaviors. I'm not going to call out names, but there are far too many examples of these. And I don't call out names mostly because we are all capable of this. Really good studies of people who jump out of airplanes with parachutes. I'm sure it's a lot of fun. It looks like a thrill, but people who do it over and over and over again often die doing other things. They often become drug addicts. You can get addicted to anything. The key is to regulate that behavior. So you asked what should people do?
What are some things, so one thing I've heard you talk about, which I find really interesting, when I think about all the things that we're doing that are disrupting things, all these unintended consequences of modern behavior, I am truly glad that cell phones, the internet, and pornography did not exist when I was younger, because I don't know if at 14 I could have been disciplined enough if I had access to that. And when you think about the things that we're doing right now that are sort of that have maybe the most grand unintended consequences, where do you land?
Yeah, on the time scale of 24 hours, one of the huge mistakes that we all make, and I've said this many times, so if people have heard me say this before, forgive me, but it turns out it's still true. Getting too much bright light exposure from the hours of 10 p.m. until 4 a.m., unless you have to work shift work, which is a unique case. That bright light exposure between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., even if you adjust the colors of the lights, you still need to get everything really, really dim, because it actually blocks the release of dopamine through a pathway that involves a structure called the habenula. The habenula was a kind of cryptic structure in the brain for a long time, but now we know there's a punishment signal in the brain. You get neurochemically punished for viewing bright light at those hours.
Why? How would that be wired in? We'd never be able to expose ourselves to bright light.
So that's a great question. So firelight won't do that. Moonlight's fine. Candles, lights that are dim or low in your environment.
How would we develop that?
So the pathway to the habenula and then to these dopamine-reducing circuits are the pain pathway that we were referring to earlier. It's a generic pathway through which lots of different types of signals and stimuli and events can punish us internally.
Fuck, this is so good, dude. And so I'm going to call this the rich kid effect. And you mentioned hard work earlier. Mm-hmm. There is a reason I think that children of wealthy parents end up imploding, because there is an evolutionary, the punishment pathway, evolutionary thing that's going on that says you didn't have to work hard for the things that you own, and because from I need you to go hunt and gather and face a saber-toothed tiger, I have to reward you for doing hard things and punish you for not doing hard things.
Well, and in the case of the generic model of the spoiled rich kid, they actually can't access dopamine. Remember that movie from the 80s? It was it was called like The Toy or something with Richard Pryor.
I was like, if this motherfucker says toy, I'm gonna have a seizure. Yes, I remember.
So
God,
Richard Pryor in that movie, and the kid has everything, and he's the epitome of the spoiled brat. All the toys, all the cars, all the things. Now we see this with people who actually go from rags to riches and then bathe in all the luxuries they didn't have as a child. These are often the athletes that don't go on to perform well again. These are people that crash because of other dopamine-seeking behaviors. I'm not going to call out names, but there are far too many examples of these. And I don't call out names mostly because we are all capable of this. We all would like to think that, if I had all that money or if I had all that success, I would really be a good human being and I wouldn't do those things. Any human being that is immersed in these dopamine circuits too much, or who gets too much pleasure without having to pursue it first and really work and actually experience pain, pleasure, ratcheting back and forth along that climb, because it wasn't just dopamine like this for you. It was probably pain, pleasure, pain, pleasure, pain, pleasure, pain, right? They're always proportional to one another. So anyone that does that, it has a tremendously hard time accessing pleasure. They can't do that. And we often think about the extremes of addiction, and those are really severe, but we also have to think about the more subtle forms of something we really love, but indulging in it just a little too often so that it no longer has that edge. There have been really good studies of people who jump out of airplanes with parachutes. I'm sure it's a lot of fun. It looks like a thrill, but people do it over and over and over again, often die doing other things. They often become drug addicts because it's a huge high. Oh yeah. Yeah, a lot of that.
Interesting.
And you know, there are a lot of examples of this. I mean, you can get addicted to anything. The key is to regulate that behavior. So you asked what should people do? Well, certainly I'm trying this now, and I have some good examples. Some young people I know and work with are taking breaks from not just social media, but no cell phone whatsoever. I'm actually trying an odd experiment, which is for the first hour of every day, no phone. Mostly because I think...
part of your 25 no-goes?
Yes, I have a bunch of no-goes.
Really interesting.
Right, so we have circuitry in the brain related to the so-called basal ganglia, and we have goes, sort of activating, think gas pedal, and then there's a lot of no-go circuitry. And learning how to keep that no-go, don't circuitry, as we could call it, tuned up is very important. And so many times throughout the day, but I try and get 25 a day, where I actively refrain from doing something that I impulsively want to do. Could be looking at my phone, but it could even be something trivial. Like I want to walk to the kitchen and get a glass of water. So I'm actively engaging in in denial, not cognitive denial, probably that too, but how would I know? But in action-based denial. So restricting my behavior in some way as a way of keeping these dopamine circuits tuned up. Also not looking at my phone first thing in the morning for an hour, because knowing what we now know about the second phase of sleep and REM sleep being more predominant, the second wave of sleep, and the fact that you're working through a lot of emotional and logistical contingencies, you're reshaping your brain in sleep. That's when neuroplasticity occurs, during sleep. It's triggered in wakefulness, but it actually takes place in sleep, especially that second half of sleep. When you wake up in the morning, you are in a perfect position to what I call receive the download of all the work that your neural circuitry has been doing the night before. But if you immediately go to a sensory experience, especially a rich sensory experience of stuff scrolling by, you're actually missing the information that you processed at night. And even more importantly, that second half of the night during REM sleep is when the emotional weight of things becomes, let's say, you put it on the shelf properly. Things that are important to emotionally register get put in one shelf. Things that were like the comment you got on Twitter that was triggering doesn't seem like such a big deal after a good night's sleep. And that's because that second half of sleep is actually when you re-experience these things, but your body can't secrete adrenaline. It's kind of an internal form of therapy or even trauma therapy. And that's why people who don't get that sleep are very, they're easily agitated. They feel like the world is crushing down on them. So when I wake up in the morning, I want to receive ideas that I want to learn from my learning. And if you take in new information, you are not in a position to do that. And 60 minutes is a tough one. So I give myself 2 no-goes for the 60-minute block if I can do it. And I'll tell you, a lot of mornings I fail, Tom. I don't do it.
Interesting.
I
found that shocking, but I heard you say that in another interview, and I was like,
well, I mean, I'm human. There are mornings where I get enticed, or worse, I find myself reflexively picking up the phone without having made the conscious decision. And that's when I realize that we are all deep in this process, and I think we have to regulate it. The experiment I'd like to do, maybe you'll do this with me as a challenge, because a challenge is always good, is in the new year, I actually want to take every odd waking hour of the day off the phone. So even hours of the day, as long as it's waking, I'm willing to have it on and work with it. But odd hours, just turn it off no matter what. I don't know if this will destroy most of the relationships in my life.